What is mass media? You may think TV and movies, but it also includes books, magazines, and other printed materials. In terms of popular culture, that is, the culture shaped by the common people, print is relatively new. So I'm going to talk about some of the oldest means of spreading stories and news among people with a shared culture. Your first review assignment is going to cover music and poetry, so this will be a good background. One way of communicating popular culture is storytelling. Every ancient culture has a storytelling element, which includes mythology, origin stories, love stories, and tales of heroism that shape and reflect their view of themselves in the world. One type we are most familiar with in our Western culture are the Homeric epics. Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were not initially written down. They were memorized and presented orally. This is true of most of the ancient tales you may have read in English class, including Gilgamesh, Beowulf, and the Aeneid. The storytellers were professionals who memorized not just the story, but the rhyme and the meter. These tales are a mix of history, mythology, and adventure story. Some of the tales may or may not be based on actual people, places, or events. Epic poems were presented somewhat musically to attentive audiences who may or may not have viewed them as tales of historical fact. These tales, along with the ancient mythology, survived this day because they were spread verbally far and wide for thousands of years before they were written down. Academic history also existed at this time in the writings of Pliny, Herodotus, and others, but the epics are examples of popular history. Oral tradition survived longer in Africa and in the Americas because paper and writing came to these regions at a later date than in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. We also have the troubadour tradition of the Middle Ages. Troubadours might be a part of a ruling household, acting as a sort of PR man, local historian, or general entertainer. They might be itinerant or traveling, using the same tunes but different tales according who would pay to be flattered. Unlike the sweeping Homeric tales, which lasted throughout the ages, most of the local ballads stayed local and were eventually forgotten. They were more like pop songs than operas. This tradition was revived in the modern era by folk singers such as Woody Guthrie, who traveled the country during the Dust Bowl and Depression era, writing and performing songs for and about local issues. Some of his work, such as This Land Is My Land, has mass appeal, but most of the 1,000-plus songs were geared toward specific local audiences, such as union organizers and migrant workers. Many were only new songs in terms of lyrics. He just used the same traditional melodies again and again, just like they did in the Middle Ages. In the 1960s, Bob Dylan was one of the many folk singers who gained fame with political protest music about social issues, the civil rights movement, and against the Vietnam War. Before the advent of recording technology, popular folk music featured more storytelling and historical elements than it does today. However, even contemporary pop and rock music often serves as a narrative or commentary on public or private interpretations, some obvious, others obscure. Poetry has also served as an artistic means of recording history. Paul Revere was not made famous so much by his 1775 Midnight Ride, but from the Longfellow poem about the events, which was written over 100 years later. Do you know who these men are? Of course you don't. Dawes and Prescott also rode out that night to warn the American colonists that the British were coming, and they were actually more successful than Revere, but nobody wrote a popular poem about them, so we don't study them in grade school. So you can see that popular and entertaining versions of events can also have lasting effects on what we as a culture consider shared history, accurate or not. Another way that news and history was shared with the populace was monumental art. This isn't paintings hung in individual homes. I'm talking about huge edifices in the middle of town. Although these guys all look the same to us and may seem symbolic or generalized, they were all in fact representations of individual people. The people who lived in this city when this structure was built knew who these people were and could read the history chiseled in the wall behind them. Of course, this kind of storytelling was far more expensive and time-consuming than fireside adventure tales. This history is written by the rich and powerful to show who is in charge and encourage social conformity. One of the best examples of this is the Assyrian relief carvings detailing the Battle of Lachish. They take up a whole room in the British Museum and were originally mounted on the palace walls of the victorious king Sennacherib. These panels can be read in order to tell the story of the battle in which the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Judah. You can also read about this in the Bible. In our culture, it is common to display photographs of weddings, graduations, selfies with a famous person, or to display trophies or awards. We do this to show off and to tell stories of our favorite or important events in our lives. Here's a picture of me with Jackie Kennedy Onassis. I show you this to prove that I once met one of the most famous people of the 20th century, and so that you will think I'm cool. Sennacherib showed this to his friends to impress them and to remind them that, in his words, he destroyed 46 fortified cities and towns of Judah and took 200,150 captives. He had this made to remind everyone how powerful he was and to show that he was rich enough to pay for something like this to be carved. He claimed that he trapped King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Good to know if you're thinking of disagreeing with Sennacherib. Of course, when you or I look at this today, the storyline is not so obvious. You have to know what you're looking at. Dr. Wineland can read this. In fact, he has read parts of it to me, but he has a PhD in ancient history. It just looks like a parade to me. It's obscure ancient history to us, but for the original audience, it was current events news. Which is why it's important to know what you're looking at and how to read it in order to understand the story correctly. The Rosetta Stone, which was the same text in 3 different languages, was discovered in 1799, but scholars weren't able to decipher it until 1822. Until the stone allowed historians to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, we could not read Egyptian stories or histories. As a civilization, we never fully lost the Greek or Latin, but our ability to understand and reclaim Egyptian history is relatively recent. And there's still a lot of ancient culture left open to interpretation. There are those who are convinced that these Utah petroglyphs are proof of extraterrestrial aliens visiting ancient people. Is this a personal dream interpretation or a historical commemoration of a public event? Meaning can be lost or misinterpreted as time passes, or by other cultures with different reference points. What will future historians make of our popular culture? If only snippets survive, what conclusions could they draw from the images we leave behind? You can't learn about a whole culture Sorry for the interruption. Something weird just popped up on my computer. I don't know if you could hear that or not. But back to the story. What will future historians make of our popular culture? If only snippets survive, what conclusions could we draw from the images that we leave behind? You can't learn about a whole culture from a few isolated fragments. You'll get the wrong idea. Normal people did not dress like this. And it's not a religious ritual. So some ancient images might just be some freaky people. Another important type of visual storytelling is religious art, not only in ancient and medieval times, but in modern times as well. In pre-literate times, when church members could not read and did not have access to personal Bibles, Sunday school lessons were major components of church decor. How many of these figures can you identify? Jesus, Mary, and the angels are pretty easy, even for non-Christians, because these images were so pervasive in our culture. But what about everyone else? Medieval Christians could read the stories and identify the characters in the stained glass that covered their church walls and windows, because they were taught the Bible stories verbally and visually. Catholic churches to this day incorporate the Stations of the Cross, even in the most modern decor, as an aid to prayer and to tell the story of the crucifixion. Visual storytelling, especially in religious art, includes a lot of symbolism that may or may not be as easily interpreted by the uninitiated or by modern audiences as it was by those in the know at the time it was made. Even illiterate Christians of the Middle Ages would have known that the winged ox represents the Apostle Luke and that the Apostle Peter always carries keys. Did you know that? I didn't. Some religious and cultural symbolism is so prevalent that it is easily read and understood by everyone in society. Most people in the Western Hemisphere in the 21st century could easily identify this scene, even if they are not Christian. But what about this one? It's actually the same scene using the iconography of an Eastern culture at a different time. You can see Mary and Jesus, the manger, and the wise men off to the left. That's Elizabeth's family on the bottom left, the angel visiting Joseph on the bottom right, and angels up above. But there's even more in there that I don't understand. Our shared cultural references can be stylized and still remain universal. But too much abstraction moves them from being popular culture into subculture, and eventually into high symbolism that is no longer shared by the masses. Would you have recognized this trio as Jesus, Mary, and Joseph if I had not just walked you through Byzantine, Afrocentric, and alien nativity scenes? Remember that when we're talking about popular culture in this course, we are focusing on communication that is aimed at a broad, middle ground audience. An earlier version of taking a selfie with a celebrity or your BFFs was having your portrait painted. We tend to look upon these old, dark museum pieces as products of the artist's creativity, but in fact, most of the old masters worked for a living, commemorating events and enshrining the social status of paying customers. All the figures in Rembrandt's The Night Watch are members of a town militia who paid to be recorded in their glory. Guess who paid the most? Another famous historic portrait is the 1434 portrait of a Flemish merchant and his wife. Art historians love this work because it's so full of symbolism. To us, this may look like a man, a pregnant woman, and their dog at home, but scholars familiar with the period, politics, and iconography are able to read this painting in a completely different context. Art historians have spent a lot of time dissecting, interpreting, and arguing over all the details in this painting for hundreds of years. The symbolism in this picture was just as clear to everyone in the 13th century as the symbolism in these pictures is to us. We all read these pictures in terms of cultural associations as to their wealth, where they live, how they speak, and even what music they listen to, even though there's no suggestion of music in the photos. But be careful to understand the difference between what is being presented to you to tell a story and what is true. That upper-class couple in the right aren't really aristocrats. They're fashion models. And that's Nick Lachey and Jessica Simpson dressed up as comic Southern stereotypes. And on the left, hip-hop J-Lo is only one of Jennifer Lopez's many public personas. These are all staged photos to sell an idea. They're neither completely true nor completely false. But not all historical paintings are self-aggrandizing. Goya painted this record of Napoleon's troops gunning down Spanish peasants to serve as evidence and remembrance. Even the title, the 3rd of May, 1808, conveys that this is a very real, specific incident. Unlike the previous two paintings, which were meant to be seen by the subject's inner circle, this painting was meant to be shown publicly as a powerful political statement. And here it is very important to consider authorship and point of view. Goya was a Spaniard who viewed Napoleon's army as brutal invaders. Consider how a French court painter might have presented this scene differently. Brave French soldiers quelling a dangerous rebellion. So when you are writing your analysis papers for this class, you always want to consider the point of view and the purpose of the author. Likewise, Picasso's Guernica expresses horror at the bombing of civilians during the Spanish Civil War. Even though the work is a cubist and abstract, it still serves as a compelling historical record of a specific horrifying event. We'll end this with another type of selfie. The man in the water is 14-year-old Brooke Watson. The city is Havana. The year is 1749. The shark bit off his leg. The painting was done by John Singleton Copley 25 years later based on Watson's account of the incident. It's such a great story. Copley painted it nearly 3 identical versions. This painting is huge. The figures are almost life-size, and it really helped Watson tell his "how I lost my leg" story to his buddies. What I want you to note here is the detail and realism in which the city, the ships, and the figures are rendered. Copley was a master at landscape and portrait painting, and he had visual references for all of these elements. However, Copley had never seen a shark, let alone a shark attack, so this part of the picture is not so realistic or accurate, and the rescue is likely not as glorious and heroic as it is depicted. So while this incident certainly happened at the place and the time shown, the painting is a big budget blockbuster version of events, with some details romanticized and over-dramatized and others filled in with creative imagination. Something to watch for in your research. Which parts are exaggerated for dramatic effect? And which parts did they just have to imagine? So, as we go through this course looking primarily at film, television, and printed books, keep an eye out for all the other sources of information about the past that are all around us. Think about how you know what you think you know. What have you learned about the world in formal schooling is very little compared to all you have absorbed by simply living with popular culture.